Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome back to Tony D's new channel. I'm Tony D. And I've been thinking about something the past few days that's not talked about that much in terms of the Beatles. And that's the fact that in the early 1970's, there were at least four occasions where there was a possibility of the Beatles reuniting. Not, not necessarily all four of them, but two of them at least. First, there was the concert for Bangladesh, where George put on this incredible rock and roll benefit concert to benefit the poor people of Bangladesh affected by the famine there. And it's important to note that when George put on this concert, he invited all three of his former bandmates, John, Paul, and Ringo. Now, John did not go to the concert because he insisted that Yoko be there to perform as well. And George said, no, we're not doing that. Go kick rocks. And Paul did not go there because, A, he thought it was way too early for any kind of reunion. And B, he knew that Alan Klein was associated with the concert from Bangladesh. And he didn't want to do anything involved with Alan Klein because Alan Klein was the charlatan huckster manager who George, John, and Ringo wanted as the new Beatles manager in '69. Paul knew he was the wrong guy for the job. He always wanted him anyway. And he didn't want this guy to be associated with anything that would have involved Paul. He didn't want him there. He didn't want to participate in anything involving Alan Klein. That's why Paul didn't show up and John didn't go because John insisted anything I do, Yoko does, and George did not hide the fact he didn't like Yoko at all. But Ringo was there on drums and performing his latest single, It Don't Come Easy. Well, his first single, technically. His first single of new music from him. And I just wanna speculate on what could have happened if John and Paul had shown up there. Because Paul only had two new albums at that point as solo artist and one new single. He had McCartney and he had Ram, and he had the single Another Day. So if Paul did go to a live concert, this live concert, with George Harrison and friends, as it's credited to, what could Paul have performed? He did have a few songs there that would have been great for a live concert. Maybe I'm Amazed from the first album. From the Ram album, Too Many People, which of course is a song very critical of John Yoko, so George might have loved that. He could have played Backseat My Car, maybe. He could have played Oh Woman, Oh Why, perhaps. Or perhaps he could have just done what people wanted to hear and go back and play Beatles songs. George played a few of them, but Paul will not play any Beatles songs until about 4 or 5 years later on the Wings of America tour, where he played 5 Beatles songs. But yeah, Paul definitely would not have done that in '71. So he might have had to stick to 2 or 3 of his new solo songs, which means maybe I'm Amazed, maybe Backseat My Car. But then again, if Paul did show up at this concert, maybe he would have said to George, well, Linda should be here on background vocals. I don't know. Maybe he would not have said that because Linda was not like Yoko, and Paul was not like John, where he needed her everywhere at every show. And then let's think about John and what could have happened if he had shown up at the concert in Bangladesh. He had one album at that point, Plastic Ono Band, and 3 hit singles, Instant Karma, Give Peace a Chance, Cold Turkey. So he could have performed Instant Karma. It would have been a real crowd pleaser, so they say. He could have played Give Peace a Chance, obviously, which makes sense with the theme of Bangladesh and relief for people. Maybe Mother, although it's kind of too personal for a big crowd like that. Although it did go over well in the one-to-one concert. So I think John, if he was there, would have probably played Instant Karma, Give It a Chance, and maybe Cold Turkey as maybe just Give It a Chance, Instant Karma, because most of the people that performed here only got 2 songs. I mean, Leon Russell only got 2, but then again, it's John. Maybe he would have gotten 3 or 4. Maybe it could have been Cold Turkey, Give It a Chance, Instant Karma, and Come Together, maybe, or yeah, Come Together is a good choice. I don't see anything off Plastic Ono Band being that great for this kind of performance, for this kind of concert. But anyway, those are my thoughts on what they could have done if John and Paul were there. I mean, just imagine it that it happened in the summer of '71, and all 4 of the Beatles were on a concert stage again, and it was for the first ever rock and roll benefit concert. The headlines could just write themselves. The Beatles reunite to save the country of Bangladesh suffering a famine. I mean, it would have been like the summer of love all over again, because 4 years before that, they did the first ever global live broadcast to perform All You Need Is Love. So 4 years later, they could have done a concert to benefit the people of Bangladesh if they didn't have these personal issues. Like I said, George never would have let Yoko perform on the same stage as him. That never ever would have happened. But anyway, that's what I think about that concert and what could have happened. It's kind of cool to think about how we were close to a legit reunion in only '71. But anyway, the second occasion when it was possible for a reunion of 2 of them came the following year in '72. Now, this I learned in the latest book of John Lennon from 2024, the Mind Games book, because on page 195 of this book is this letter that John, or rather a telegram, that John sent to Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney. And on this telegram he writes, "Right on, brother and sister. Now what do we do with The Luck of the Irish and Sunday Bloody Sunday?" Referring, of course, to 2 songs he had just written and recorded for his album Sometime in New York City. 2 songs he wrote in response to Sunday Bloody Sunday, this horrible thing where the Irish army or something killed Englishmen. I forget exactly what happened, but this was big in '72. But anyway, he also wrote, "Would you do a Madison Square Garden with Wings, Plastic Ono Band, and Stones? We've already talked to Mick Jagger. Also in 3 weeks. Actually go to Ireland, possibly with the Stones. Let's forget our past and save some people. Good luck. Anyway, we're proud of you. Love, Sonny and Cher, Lennon," obviously being very sarcastic. He was inviting them to play a live benefit concert in Madison Square Garden with John, Yoko, and the Rolling Stones, February 7th. That's the date of the telegram. Now, we don't know what Paul thought of this, because there's no information about that in here. Yeah. Yeah, clearly John was in a place to perform live with Paul again. And, Paul just released the first ever Wings single, Give Ireland Back to the Irish, reacting to that horrible occasion, that horrible tragedy where Brits were shot down by the Irish army or something. And it was very similar to John's political protest song about the same thing. And he thought, right on, let's protest this thing together and really do a real rock and roll concert protesting this injustice. That was where John's mind was at that time. He was, having the mindset of a radical political activist slash rock star slash singer. And yeah, we've recently seen the film Power to the People, John and Yoko in New York City, where John is performing this concert to benefit this orphanage with mentally challenged children. And this was a similar deal to what he was suggesting that Paul and Linda do with him and the Stones. And once again, we could have had two of the Beatles at the same concert in '72. But I don't know what Paul thought of this letter, if he even got it all. Maybe he thought it was a joke. I don't know. Maybe he just... But it's so fascinating that even in '72, John was at the mindset to perform with his old friend again. And Paul was just in the beginning stages of his band Wings, which just released their first album to not so great reviews or sales, although I highly regard that album highly now, the Wings Wildlife album. And they released 3 standalone singles in '72. But Paul could have gone back on stage with John for one show. I guess John didn't follow through with the whole idea of a show with him and the Stones. But it's really fascinating that he was so gung-ho to do this. And I think at that time he was just gung-ho to do anything that seemed fun and not thinking about it too much. But anyway, that leads me to the third occasion where there was almost a reunion. And similar thing, too, where John was just thinking on the spur of the moment, because in 1974, he is separated from Yoko Ono, and he is with May Pang romantically. And they both go to New York City and meet with George Harrison, who is currently on his first and only tour as a solo artist, first and only concert tour. And they go meet with him, and he says to John, "I'm glad you're with May now. She's really a lovely girl." And John agrees, saying, "I know she is. I'm glad you like her too." And then John says to George, "Well, maybe I can come help you," as in help him on this concert tour and perform in a show with him. Now, what happens next is very sad, because George reacts to this with great anger. At first he says, "That'd be nice." Then George's anger really burst forth. "Where were you when I needed you?" he snapped. It was the first in a series of explosions. "I did everything you said, but you weren't there." "You always knew how to reach me," John would reply. George's anger with John had been accumulating with them for years. George said that repeatedly in the past he had sung what John wanted him to sing on Beatles songs, said what John wanted him to say, because John wanted. George went along with the decision to go with Alan Klein, but he didn't have to do that, really. In the nearly 4 years since, John had virtually ignored him, a fact that pained George deeply. His voice grew even more harsh as he blasted John for his sudden appearance. "I did everything you said, but you weren't there." And he just gets furious at John, demanding to see his eyes. And he even stomps on his glasses. He reached up and quickly took them off and put on regular glasses. "I still can't see your eyes," he says. His face was a mask of fear and contempt. George's anger even paralyzed John. And this is all from May Pang's perspective in her wonderful memoir, Loving John. And then he later says to May, I'll go out and help him or whatever it is he wants me to do. If he wants me to go on stage, I will. You two are like brothers, she told him. I can't stand it when people like you, who love each other so much, can't get along. And John never did perform with George at that show or any concert. George just felt, I started this tour without you, I can finish it without you. And he was so angry with him for feeling like he was an inferior during the Beatle days. Like he did. But then John and May saw George's concert the following day and was relieved that Ravi Shankar, the Indian musician, was not there, saying, "Thank God, we don't have to go through that." They watched from the wings, and some kids sitting in the first few rows spotted us and began to scream for John, so we stepped back. John didn't want the spotlight taken away from George, so perhaps it's a good thing he didn't perform live at the show. And to me, that's one of the saddest stories about George and John. That they didn't share their feelings as much. And George just let his resentment at John grow and grow. But again, this is a case where if the feelings with them were more healthy, maybe, it's possible that George would have said yes to John performing with him live on stage. Which again, I just can't imagine that happening. I just can't imagine during that 74 tour, Madison Square Garden, John performing with George Harrison. I just can't imagine it. I don't think it would have happened. But now I want to get to, of course, the final and most fascinating occurrence of a possible Beatle reunion happening. And, I really love Maypan. And I think if you haven't read her memoir called Loving John, you should. Although it's out of print now, and I had to buy it on eBay for a lot of money. But when she was with John and he was separated from Yoko, she encouraged him to reunite with Paul, telling him, when the two of you are separate, you're good. When you're together, you're great and you're on fire. And he talked about possibly going to New Orleans to see Paul as Paul was about to record the next Wings album, Venus and Mars. And there were no exact plans to record with Wings, but that could have happened. Because she says in her book right here, that evening we got a call from Paul. He and Lynn were going to New Orleans to begin a new album. We'd like you to meet us there, Paul told John. I'd really like to go, John said. I've never been to New Orleans, and it's Mardi Gras season, cheeky John. I'd love to see it. It'll be fun to watch Paul record. I was pretty sure that if I can get John into New Orleans, Paul would do the rest and get him into the studio to record with him. It was a very exciting prospect, but I said nothing about it, because I didn't want to put John off. But he kept bringing up the trip, and each time he mentioned it, he grew more enthusiastic. He seemed unaware of the possibility of recording with Paul again, but I think deep down he also realized he and Paul finally were ready to work together again. However, sadly, this did not happen, and it has to do with John deciding to go back to New York to be with Yoko, and that meant, of course, leaving May, and this happened because Yoko offered John something he could not resist, and that was this hypnosis a hypnotic cure to cure his addiction to cigarettes. Now, why he felt he had to go to Yoko to do this is very odd. But as he said to May, she knew the best people for this. Yoko's really good at finding people who can do these things, and she would try and tell him that he could find hypnosis for this anywhere. He was determined to go to Yoko's hypnotist. Now, that does not mean that she hypnotized him to stay with her, obviously. You know, John was married to Yoko. It wasn't like he wasn't planning on staying with May forever and going back with Paul, which sometimes I think might have been a good idea. I know this is a hot take, but I often believe that May could have been a much better partner for John than Yoko. But that's a different topic for another day, pun intended. But going back to Yoko, of course, meant that John did not reunite with Paul, and he did not go to New Orleans to watch Paul and Wings record Venus and Mars. And again, we have no idea what in the world would have happened if John had been there. We don't know if Paul and the band would have given John a chance to perform vocals on those Wings songs. We don't know what they could have, if John and Paul could have written something to add to the album. We don't know because there were no plans made at all. But it's not just about the fact that John did not reunite with Paul in the album. It's about the fact he was getting closer to Paul, no pun intended, getting closer to him as a friend once again. And then suddenly he goes back to Yoko, who didn't really want him to be hanging out with his friends like Paul and George. And while, I mean, again, the Venus and Mars Wings album is so perfect as it is that I just can't imagine John being on there and changing it to making it any better at all. Maybe it would have been the same, but with a little bit more. I don't know. Again, it's not about the music though, it's about the friendship. John had just gone to New Orleans and just watched Wings record the album without adding anything to the music. That could have been an incredible thing in of itself right there. If he had simply reunited that friendship, but not the creative collaboration, it would have been such an incredible thing. And possibly after that, they could have written a song together or two. But again, it's about the friendship. People don't understand that John and Paul had something way deeper than just your average friendship. It was a great love. And I don't want to get to a whole Yoko rant here, but I don't like that she did this at the very same time that John and Paul were getting closer, pun intended. And again, I know that John was not meant to stay with May, but she did great things for him. It was because of May that he saw his son Julian for the first time in years. And it was because of May that he spent time with Paul again. Now, I'm not blaming this on Yoko, obviously, because he did see Paul a few times while he was living with Yoko in Dakota. But it would have been so great if John had just hung out with Paul and the band Wings and Linda, who was in Wings, obviously. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on those 4 little times when there was this tiny possibility of the Beatles reuniting on stage, and in this case on record, and 2 Beatles reuniting on stage. They reunited, several times on on studio albums, of course. You got John and Ringo on the Plastic Ono Band album. But it would just be so different if it was on a live stage. And it would be so different if John and Paul's friendship was reunited even more. And that's one of the saddest things about the late 70s was the John and Paul friendship just couldn't continue because John didn't want him there when he was raising his son Sean. But anyway, that's where I'm gonna wrap this up here. And yeah, those are my thoughts on all that. So thanks for watching this, and comment what you think about all this.